Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather, and on this very chilly day before Mother's Day here in the US, I thought I would take my videos in a slightly different direction and pay homage to books that I may never have read had it not been for my mother. Now, my mother is wonderful. She is also a librarian. However, I would like to think that she still would have done these things even if she hadn't been a librarian. I think possibly the first thing and the most important thing that she did for my reading was to read so much herself and to let me have access to so much reading material. Because I saw her reading all the time, and indeed many of my other family members, I picked up the idea, even when I wasn't really talking, that this was something that one just did. So I would investigate as well. My mother was always sure to have lots of small books with us when we went anywhere, and certainly about the house. There were also sacrificial magazines down at my level that my parents didn't mind if I crinkled or ripped in my attempts to turn pages. I always tried to be careful, but coordination at about a year old is not terrific. And I was allowed to study them carefully, and I did study them carefully. I certainly wasn't reading yet, but I knew that eventually this would make sense to me. And I always loved being told stories. So I cannot thank her enough for setting that wonderful example for me. There were also many things that we read together at many stages of my life. She always made sure to read with me and my father as well. But one of the things that we particularly loved to read that my dad didn't love as much were the original Winnie-the-Pooh stories by A.A. Milne. Now here in the States, I don't know that the original Winnie-the-Pooh stories are as well known as the Disney versions, which are relatively true. However, they miss out on so much subtle humor and beautiful storytelling. I'm so glad she read these with me. And in addition, she had some records that I was allowed to play with when I was a little bit older, so that I could listen to these stories being read to me by the actor Maurice Evans, who you may know if you ever watched the original series of Bewitched. Plus, this edition is beautiful in terms of it has the original pen and ink illustrations. So I always loved looking at those, especially Eeyore Has a Birthday. I think these really formed part of my sense of humor. In addition, I was always allowed to look through my parents' books, and I loved flipping through her Charlie Brown collection. My mother was a massive fan of Peanuts cartoons by Charles Schulz, and so I grew up to be just as big a fan. I think these also helped shape my sense of humor, my knowledge of how to deliver a joke, and how to embrace the small joys in life as well as the ridiculous moments in life. My mother also helped form my love of the Tudors, and I read many Tudor books, and I actually did a video all about those Tudor books. But it all started because I discovered these paper dolls way back when. I'm particularly proud of the way that I colored Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard here, but I do have all 6. And I wanted to play with them. I loved paper dolls, and these looked really interesting, but my mother wanted me to be able to play with them correctly. So she told me a 6-year-old friendly version of the story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives. And that started my fascination with the Tudors, and it has stayed with me ever since. The first book that I read, not 2 years later, was Mary Bloody Mary by Carolyn Meyer, which is a wonderful book for any age if you are interested in getting into the Tudors, which tells the story of Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and marriage to Anne Boleyn from Mary I's perspective, his daughter, who would have been a young teenager at the time. Years later, I am still obsessed, and I got my friend Amanda obsessed, and so here we all are, thanks to my mother. Another book series that I probably never would have found as a child was the Henry Reed series. This is Henry Reed Incorporated by Keith Robertson, which were some of my mother's favorite books when she was growing up. They tell the story of Henry Reed, who is the son of American diplomats, so they live all over the world. But every summer, he is sent back to the States to spend the summer with his aunt and uncle in Grover's Corner, New Jersey. And every year, some sort of adventure happens, especially with his friend Midge, who lives down the road. And the two of them just get themselves into incredible scrapes that are always very funny. In this particular book, he has a special school assignment to record his experiences and investigate American free enterprise. And so he tries to start his own business with the help of Midge and his dog Agony. These are a wonderful series. I also love the one where he and Midge and his aunt and uncle drive out to the Grand Canyon in Arizona, especially as on the way home they drive with a trunk full of fireworks. They are wonderfully funny, but I never would have discovered them if my mother hadn't read them first. Even into my later years, my mother was still influencing my reading. Firstly, she is chiefly responsible for my love of Shakespeare and my choice of my favorite Shakespeare play. When I was 12, in one of my classes, we were assigned to watch a Shakespeare play, and everyone else watched Hamlet, and so then we were all forced to watch Hamlet together, and it was the Mel Gibson Hamlet, and I hated it, and it was just the most dreadful thing, and my mother agreed that that is not the best adaptation of Hamlet. But she didn't want me to hate Shakespeare forever, and she knew that Hamlet would not be the one for me, especially not as a starter play. Now, as an adult, I love it, but at 12, not the best one to start with. So she brought home the film of Much Ado About Nothing, and it quickly became my favorite. I loved all of the verbal sparring and the wordplay. I loved how utterly silly it was and how utterly heartbreaking and real it was at the same time. I loved that a woman got to be strong and independent and funny and still got to fall in love. I adore everything about this play, and I owe it all to my mother knowing my taste. Soon afterwards, remembering how much I had loved the Austen adaptations of Wishbone, and knowing how much I adored Much Ado About Nothing, she brought home Sense and Sensibility, the film. And of course, both of those films starred Emma Thompson, so she used that as a link. I adored the film. I didn't love the book as much when I tried to read it right then, because I was still 12. The style was a little bit difficult for me at that point. But I loved the film, and I kept watching it, such that a year later, I was inspired to read Pride and Prejudice, and that was my gateway into actually reading Austen because of how funny it was from the start. So while I technically discovered Austen, and particularly Pride and Prejudice, on my own, I owe it to my mother to kickstart my interest in Austen with Sense and Sensibility. In my teens, she also convinced me to read a few other books, the first of which was Christy by Catherine Marshall, which I know some people here on BookTube absolutely love, and I am thrilled, but not many other people know about it, and I'm not sure that I would have ever found it if it hadn't been one of my mother's favorites. And it tells the story of Christy Huddleston, who as a young woman goes as a missionary to a town in Appalachia in the Smoky Mountains to work as a teacher there. and all of the incredible students that she meets and all of their quirks and foibles and of course their families. She also gets into a bit of a love triangle between the young minister and the doctor. It is a beautiful story. There is strong Christian messaging. However, I particularly loved her interactions with all of the school children, and I think you can relate to those no matter what faith you adhere to. It's a beautiful, beautiful story, so I thank my mother for introducing me to it, and indeed to the television series that was made afterwards. And finally, both my mother and my English teacher, in my final year of high school, convinced me to read Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. I have always loved Scotland and Scottish history ever since I was very young, and then when my English teacher had read them and started telling me how wonderful they were, I remembered that my mom had them on her shelves and that she loved reading them, that my grandmother had been reading them with her, so I decided to pick them up as well, and I fell in love. If you're unfamiliar with it or the show, it's the story of Claire Beecham, who is a young wife who has been a nurse in the war for many years. World War II has just ended, and she goes on holiday with her husband to Scotland to kind of rekindle their romance since they've been away from each other for so long. And she finds some standing stones on a walk by herself one day, and when she touches them, she is shot back 200 years to 1745, right smack into the middle of the Jacobite uprising. And she falls in with Jamie Fraser. And their lives take turns that they could never have predicted, but it is beautiful, it is gripping, they are just fabulously done, and I cannot wait for the new book. And again, I owe it all to my mother having these on our shelves for me to think about for years before finally sparking the interest to read them. So there you have it. Thank you, Mom, for inspiring me to read all of these wonderful books and indeed sparking a love of books so that I read so many more based on these small starts. If you loved any of these books as well, let me know down below. If your mom introduced you to a variety of books, please let me know. If you think you have another recommendation for me, please let me know. Until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. And happy Mother's Day. Bye, everyone.